There's a moment that historians have studied for 5 centuries and still cannot fully explain. On the night of May 28, 1453, the last Roman emperor on Earth removed his purple imperial robes, folded them carefully, and set them aside. He had worn that purple his entire life. It marked him as the direct successor of Augustus, of Constantine, of Justinian, 1100 years of unbroken imperial lineage running through his bloodline like a current. He set it aside, put on the armor of a common soldier, walked out into the darkness toward the Ottoman lines, and was never seen again. Constantine XI did not surrender. He did not flee by ship. He did not negotiate. He chose to die as a soldier in the city his ancestors had built, rather than live as a trophy in someone else's empire. The city he died defending had stood for 1100 years. It had survived Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Russians, and Crusaders. It had been the beating heart of the civilized world for longer than most nations have existed. And what it really looked like, what actually filled those streets, those markets, those impossible buildings before the walls finally broke, has been buried under 6 centuries of myth, nationalism, and the memory of the conquerors. That story begins not with a battle. It begins with a decision made beside a narrow strip of water that changed the entire trajectory of human history. In 324 AD, a Roman emperor named Constantine I stood on a narrow triangular peninsula jutting into the meeting point of 2 seas, and made a calculation that no ruler before him had been bold enough to make. Rome was dying. Not militarily, not yet, but spiritually, structurally, administratively. The old city on the Tiber was too far from the empire's most threatened frontiers, too saturated with the political rivalries of old senatorial families, too anchored to a pagan past that Constantine had just decisively broken with by embracing Christianity. The empire needed a new center of gravity, and Constantine had found the most extraordinary piece of real estate on Earth to build it on. He personally walked the boundaries of the new city, reportedly covering ground so vast that his generals asked him when he intended to stop. He pointed forward and said he would stop when the one walking ahead of him stopped. No one else saw anyone walking ahead of him. Within 6 years, the new Rome rose from the peninsula. It took his name, and it would outlive its founder by 11 centuries. To understand why Constantinople became what it became, you have to understand the Bosphorus. 17 miles long, half a mile wide at its narrowest point. The only navigable passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, between the grain fields of what is now Ukraine and the hungry markets of the entire ancient and medieval world. Every ship carrying wheat, timber, furs, amber, slaves, and salted fish from the Black Sea had to pass through this strait. Every merchant traveling between Europe and Asia had to cross it. The city that sat at its mouth did not merely benefit from this geography, it owned it. Constantinople collected tolls, controlled access, and could close the strait to any fleet it chose with chains stretched across the water and fire launched from its walls. In the entire span of human history, no city has ever occupied a more strategically dominant geographic position. The Bosphorus was not Constantinople's advantage. It was Constantinople's immortality. As long as the city controlled that water, no economic or military force on Earth could afford to ignore it. At its absolute peak under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, Constantinople held between 500,000 and 800,000 people, a population so vast it would not be matched anywhere in Europe for nearly 1,000 years after its fall. To walk its boundaries was to walk 14 miles of land walls so thick that 2 chariots could race side by side along their tops. Sea walls ran the entire coastline on both sides of the peninsula, rising directly from the water. Inside those walls, the Mise, the great central boulevard, ran the full length of the city in a straight line, flanked by marble colonnades on both sides, interrupted every few hundred meters by a forum, a triumphal arch, or an imperial monument. It was the most extraordinary urban thoroughfare in the ancient world, wider than most Roman roads, cleaner than anything in Western Europe, lined with statues looted from every corner of the classical world. Apollo from Delphi, a column of Constantine visible from miles away, topped with a statue of the emperor himself, cast in the image of the sun god. The city did not just accommodate civilization, it performed it. And then there was the building that made every other building on Earth feel inadequate. In 532 AD, after rioters burned the original church to the ground during the Nika revolt, Justinian commissioned a replacement that would make the entire world understand, in a single glance, what Constantinople believed about itself and about God. He gave the commission to Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, not architects in the conventional sense, but mathematicians, men who understood geometry and physics at a level their contemporaries could barely follow. What they designed was structurally impossible by the engineering standards of their time. A dome 102 feet in diameter, floating above the nave without any visible means of support, its base ringed by 40 windows so precisely positioned that the light they admitted made the dome appear to hover, untethered, between earth and heaven. When Justinian entered the completed building in 537 AD, he stood in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." He was not wrong. The Hagia Sophia was the largest enclosed space on Earth. It would hold that distinction for nearly 1,000 years. No building constructed anywhere in the world before or since has created the same sensation of standing inside an argument that God exists. But walk out of the Hagia Sophia and into the streets, and what surrounded you was not sacred. It was overwhelming. The Hippodrome ran directly alongside the Imperial Palace, a stadium seating 100,000 people, its central spine decorated with monuments collected from the farthest reaches of the ancient world. An Egyptian obelisk carved for Thutmose III 15 centuries before Constantinople existed. The serpent column, cast from the melted shields of Persian soldiers defeated at Plataea. A column of porphyry brought from Rome. The Hippodrome was not a sports venue. It was a museum of conquered civilizations arranged as a racetrack. Walk further and you pass beneath the aqueduct of Valens, still carrying fresh water across the city's skyline on arches 60 feet high, feeding a distribution network of cisterns so vast that the largest of them, the Basilica cistern, stored enough water to supply the entire city through a years-long siege. 80,000 square meters, 336 columns. Fish still swim in it today. The smell of bread from the imperial grain dole drifted through the market districts, where Syrian silk merchants argued prices with Venetian traders who had sailed 3 weeks to reach these docks. Constantinople did not feel like a medieval city. It felt like the future that never arrived anywhere else. And inside that city moved people whose stories the history books consistently fail to tell. Theodora began her life in the Hippodrome, not as a spectator, but as a performer. The daughter of a bearkeeper, working the crowds in ways that polite Byzantine society spent centuries trying to forget. She became Justinian's mistress, then his wife, then his co-emperor in every practical sense of the word. When the Nika riots of 532 AD turned so violent that Justinian's advisors urged him to flee the city by sea, it was Theodora who stood in the throne room and refused. She said, and the historian Procopius recorded her words, that she would rather die in imperial purple than live without it. Justinian stayed. The riots were crushed. The empire survived. Without Theodora's nerve in that single room on that single afternoon, the Hagia Sophia would never have been built. Justinian would have fled, the city would have fallen to the rioters, and the entire subsequent history of Byzantine civilization pivots on whether one woman decided to stand her ground. She did. And then there was Anna Komnene, 12th century princess, military historian, and author of the Alexiad, a meticulous account of her father's reign that stands as the first full autobiography written by a woman in European history. Constantinople did not just produce great emperors, it produced great minds in every register. And it produced one weapon that the rest of the world spent 300 years desperately trying to steal and never successfully decoded: Greek fire. A liquid incendiary compound that burned on water, could not be extinguished by water, and was projected from bronze tubes mounted on Byzantine warships in pressurized streams that turned enemy fleets into floating pyres. Its precise chemical composition was a state secret so closely guarded that the formula was apparently never written down in any surviving document. Modern chemists and military historians have proposed dozens of reconstructions involving quicklime, naphtha, pine resin, and saltpeter. None has fully replicated what Byzantine sources describe. Greek fire saved Constantinople from Arab naval sieges in 674, and again in 717 AD. Two moments when, without it, the city would almost certainly have fallen. Islam would have swept into Europe centuries earlier, and the entire subsequent history of Western civilization follows a completely different path. One classified chemical formula, held by one city, and the world as we know it may exist because that secret was kept. By the 10th and 11th centuries, Constantinople had become something no single word adequately describes. It was simultaneously the political capital of the Byzantine Empire, the spiritual headquarters of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the commercial hub connecting the Silk Road to the Atlantic, and the largest repository of classical knowledge left on Earth. Merchants from every civilization on the planet converged on its docks. Genoese traders occupied their own fortified quarter across the Golden Horn at Galata. Russian princes traveled down the Dnieper River specifically to trade here, and their chronicles describe Constantinople with a reverence bordering on religious awe. The Varangian Guard, elite soldiers recruited from Scandinavia, England, and Russia, protected the emperor in a city where you could hear a dozen languages in a single market stall. Silk from China moved through these customs houses, spices from India, grain from Ukraine, gold from West Africa. Constantinople was not the center of medieval trade because it was the largest city. It was the largest city because it was the center of medieval trade. The geography made it inevitable. The Byzantines made it magnificent. And while the merchants traded and the soldiers drilled, the scholars copied. This is the part of Constantinople's story that carries perhaps the greatest consequence for the world you live in today. Through the darkest centuries of European history, when the Western Roman Empire had collapsed, when literacy rates across the continent had fallen catastrophically, when the works of Plato and Aristotle and Sophocles and Thucydides existed in Western Europe in fragments, if at all, Constantinople's scriptoria kept copying. Monks and scholars in the city's monasteries and imperial libraries maintained and reproduced the entire corpus of classical Greek literature, philosophy, mathematics, and drama. Without Constantinople, Plato almost certainly does not survive. Aristotle in his complete form does not survive. The plays of Sophocles and Euripides do not survive. When Greek scholars began fleeing west in the decades before and after 1453, carrying their manuscripts with them, they did not just bring books. They ignited the Italian Renaissance. The intellectual revolution that produced Leonardo, Michelangelo, Copernicus, and eventually the scientific method traveled west from Constantinople in the luggage of refugees. The modern world has a parent, and that parent spoke Greek and lived behind 14 miles of walls on the Bosphorus. But the walls, in the end, could not protect Constantinople from itself. The wound that killed the city was not struck in 1453. It was struck in 1204. In that year, the armies of the Fourth Crusade, Western Christian soldiers who had taken the cross to fight Muslims in the Holy Land, were diverted by Venetian financial interests and Byzantine political intrigue to attack Constantinople instead. The city that had held against every external enemy for 9 centuries was sacked by people who called themselves its brothers in faith. The Hagia Sophia was looted. The Hippodrome was stripped. Centuries of accumulated art, treasure, and irreplaceable manuscripts were carried west on Venetian ships. A Latin emperor was installed on the Byzantine throne. The population, which had stood close to 500,000 before 1204, never recovered. The financial base that had funded the walls, the navy, and the grain dole was gone. The empire that limped on for another 2.5 centuries after 1204 was a ghost of what it had been, still wearing the clothes of a superpower, still carrying the title of Rome, but hollowed out from within by the people who were supposed to be its allies. The Ottoman cannons of 1453 broke the walls. The Crusaders of 1204 had already broken everything else. On the night of May 28, 1453, Constantine XI gathered his commanders in the Hagia Sophia for a final liturgy. He asked forgiveness from anyone he had wronged. He embraced his generals. He walked out into the dark. By dawn, the Ottoman army had found a small, unlocked gate in the sea walls, the Kerkoporta, and poured through it. The sound of the city falling was heard by sailors anchored miles out in the Bosphorus. Mehmed II rode into Constantinople on a white horse, dismounted at the Hagia Sophia, and gave the order to convert it to a mosque on the spot. He walked to the ruins of the imperial palace, looked at the magnificence that was already beginning to decay, and reportedly recited a verse of Persian poetry. The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of the Caesars. The owl calls the watches in the towers of Afrasiab. He was 21 years old. He had just ended an empire that had lasted 1,100 years. He wept. Whether from grief or from awe, no one recorded. And then something happened that no other fallen civilization had managed before or since. The city did not become a ruin. The scholars who fled west in the decades surrounding 1453 carried their manuscripts into Florence, Venice, and Rome, and directly seeded the intellectual explosion of the Renaissance. Roman law, preserved and refined in Byzantine legal codes, survived in the Ottoman administrative system, and eventually flowed into the legal traditions of modern Europe. The Hagia Sophia stood. The walls stood. The cisterns still held water. The Bosphorus still ran between two continents. Within a generation, Istanbul, the city's new name, derived simply from the Greek phrase meaning "in the city," was again the largest and most cosmopolitan urban center in the world, under Suleiman the Magnificent. The conqueror had not replaced the city, he had inherited it, and the city, as it had always done, absorbed him. Here is the paradox that 6 centuries have not resolved. Constantinople fell on May 29, 1453, and yet the city that fell that day is still standing. You can walk its walls. You can stand inside the Hagia Sophia and look up at the dome that Anthemius built in 537 AD and still feel what Justinian felt when he walked in for the first time. You can drink from water that flows through aqueducts the Byzantines built. The manuscripts that left with the refugees built the Renaissance that built the modern world. The legal codes survived. The geography survived. The city survived. Every other great civilization of the ancient and medieval world left ruins. Rome, Babylon, Persepolis, Carthage. Constantinople left a living city of 15 million people still sitting on the same peninsula, still controlling the same strait, still standing at the meeting point of 2 continents and 2 seas. It did not fall. It did not become a ruin. It just changed its name and kept going.